All right, guys, we are live. So with that, let me go around the room real quick and introduce a couple people we have on the line with us real quick. This is a quick roundtable on Ukraine, on what's going on, and I'm sure a lot of people have some questions. Feel free to post them if you want to, and we'll try to get with them as we go. Right now, we have one of our staff guys on, Tom Marshall. Tom?
Hey guys, Tom Marshall. I'm a staff editor with RECOIL and then also lead editor for RECOIL's sister publication, Off Grid. I'm a service academy graduate. I've got 4 years in the Army as a cavalry officer. I got out as a captain. I left that job and then went on to spend another couple of years working overseas as an independent contractor for the U.S. government. And then I left that position and I've been at RECOIL ever since.
All right, roger that. Next in line, we have retired General Vincent Buggs. Vincent, apparently he didn't get enough in the military that now that he's retired, the guy's still giving back to the community. He's a local high school teacher now, so he just can't get enough helping people out. So, General, I know you're currently running your own podcast with Embrace the Power. So, a few words, don't mind.
I appreciate it, Glenn. Hey guys, glad to be here on RECOIL. I'm retired General Vince Buggs. I run Embrace the Power. You can check it out at embracethepower.org. And we're here to talk about Ukraine and just kind of kick it around and see what comes out of it. And looking at from the history standpoint all the way to where we're at now and see where we're getting. And we're going to let Thomas just run the show, and him and Glenn. And I'm just here to support fires. All right.
Just a quick admin note for everybody watching and listening. Like we said, Glenn will be taking questions. If you've got them, if you're on Zoom, you can chat them in. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can drop a comment in the live, and we'll be going through those questions, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end. We can answer at least a couple of them. In the meantime, we've got some bullet points we're going to go to try and bring you guys all up to speed on what's happening, where it came from, how the hell we got here, and maybe talk a little bit about where we might be going. So we're going to start with some of the history. This is not necessarily a new power struggle in the region, although it's maybe something that's new for us. If we're not Eastern history specialists or we don't have family in the area, maybe we woke up a couple of days ago and all of a sudden there's a shooting war on a Russian border. So, but it didn't necessarily happen quite that fast for the people that are living there every day. So, General, I'm going to give you a chance to kind of run down what you know in terms of the history of this and how we got to where we are now.
All right. So there's been always an internal conflict between Russia and Ukraine. 1933 to 1935, they had the Holodomor genocide, is where there was a famine in the Eastern Bloc, and Russia pretty much starved the Ukrainians out, and Stalin pretty much took all the food and allowed the Ukrainian peasants to die, and then they rose up in arms. So there's always been some friction points between the Ukrainians and the United States. Hence, those soldiers that served in Iraq and some in Afghanistan, but definitely in Iraq, the Ukrainians actually sent forces to Iraq to support U.S. operations there to be able to get into NATO or become what they call a partner of NATO, so that they have protection against the Russians. However, the Russians, realizing this and wanting a buffer zone, have pushed into Ukraine, and that's where we're at today, is because of the homage that thinking that Ukraine may become part of NATO, and that's where we're at, Thomas, and we're more to follow as you go through the questions.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Let's actually, but before let's I do want to touch on one thing that you mentioned there in terms of the buffer zone and satellite states. For those of us who aren't history buffs, you mentioned earlier before we went live about kind of going back to a Warsaw Pact mentality. Excuse me. Run us down what the Warsaw Pact was in terms of how it being sort of an opposition force for NATO, and then why that makes holding on to the Ukraine so important for Russia.
Oh, absolutely. So under Truman, after World War II, under Truman, the Russians established themselves in Eastern Germany and surrounded Berlin when we had the Berlin airlift. Under that establishment, the United States stood up NATO. So the Warsaw Pact was the counter to NATO because Stalin felt threatened by the West. And then it started the nuclear arms race. However, the key thing about all of this is that those areas that fell after the wall came down due to economic strife that was put into the Eastern Bloc. In many ways, Putin was one of the younger agents or KGB possibly that were working then, and he saw the fall of Russia, and he had issues with it supposedly. And so now, as fast forward now, we are literally looking at, we're revisiting possibly strongholds within the Eastern Bloc buffers going into Russia, and that reestablishes some of what would be the Warsaw Pact, which was the countries that were consumed with Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Tito and all the other dictators or leaders that were in the Eastern Bloc during that time. So Thomas, the thing we look at now is how far will Russia go? And then where are they going to probably establish their outposts? Because those outposts now will cause some constraints for travel, possibly in the immediate future. So now that when we had open borders with free flow, the question is now, within the next 6 months, 7 months, will we still have those open borders?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a whole lot of people in that part of the world that are really concerned about that right now. Plus how it affects Western travelers and people, Americans and other Europeans with families in that area. And we'll touch on that a little more later. So now we've had a real broad strokes rundown of kind of how we got here and what the dynamic in play is. We can talk about what's happened so far. It's obviously only been a couple of days since Putin went on TV and declared what he called a, quote, special military operation, which somehow translated into code for all-out land invasion. But that's the phraseology he chose to use. So we're going to talk about some of the key points. A lot of this stuff you guys have probably seen if you're following anything on Instagram or Twitter or Reddit or Facebook. Some of these kind of major, highlights of the invasion itself have kind of been made pretty public. One is Russian forces capturing an airport right outside of Kiev, the capital city. Another big thing that's hit the news was Russian forces capturing Chernobyl, a now defunct or largely defunct nuclear power plant that was actually the site of a pretty bad nuclear disaster in the 80s and still contains a lot of radioactive waste on site. There's the story that's been circulating about Snake Island or Serpent Island, which is an island off the coast of Ukraine that had been manned by the military, by the Ukrainian military, and just within the last 24 hours was overrun by the Russians. So with all of that, those are some kind of the major key points in terms of strategic targets that have been, taken or are under attack already right now. Generally, you want to give us whatever comes to your mind in terms of those particular, the airport, Snake Island, or Chernobyl, which a lot of people seem to have questions on, myself included. But what are your thoughts on all that?
All right, so what Putin has really done and what Russian forces have really done is establish themselves for advanced placement, APODs and SPODs. And they're able to resupply themselves, but also project further power out within the region. And it's going to be interesting to see down the road here how the Ukrainians react. At this point right now, because of the Russians' overwhelmingly ability to push out lethality, that's going to be a struggle for the Ukrainians to match, pound for pound on lethality and kinetic actions. But as time progresses, it'll be interesting to see if they kind of revert to some of the different tactics of the French, the French resistance force, or the Ukrainian become the resistant force, and as Russia gets established. But yeah, those key areas, and you brought up Chernobyl, but here's the thing with Chernobyl is that there is possibly still some rods there. There's possibly something still there that the Russians, for some reason, the Russians looked at it as a key area that they needed to get their hands on. We won't know until the end of this kind of why the Russians chose to have to go back after Chernobyl. So I'm more of the follow, but I'm going to tell you they didn't go there because there was nothing there for them to go get. So there's definitely a reason that became a point of interest that for the Russian government and for the Russian forces. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, if nothing else, maybe just to unsettle us as why would you want that place again? I mean, why are you occupying that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's definitely a hell of a psychological operation, that's for sure. And I know it's got a lot of people, not just in Ukraine, but well beyond, including us, kind of scratching our heads. trying to figure out, what might still be there for them. But like you said, General, it certainly isn't nothing. So for better or worse, we're gonna have to wait to see on that one, I think. So that, which brings me to my next point, which is right now, they are at the gates, proverbially speaking, of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. And the Russians are claiming that they took a strategically significant airport just to the west, which allows them to have what's called an air bridge, a direct line to air transport forces and equipment and weapons into the area immediately surrounding the capital city. We're sure it's going to be an intensely tense weekend for the capital. And obviously, once you take the capital of a country, as we saw in Afghanistan, unfortunately, not too long ago, as soon as Kabul fell, it was pretty much game over for the country as far as the Taliban was concerned. And there's certainly some worry that, if the Russians can capture the capital city of the entire country over the weekend, or not long thereafter, that, what does that mean for the rest of the country? And where do the Russians go once they seize the capital?
Well, yeah, you make a great point. And so I hate to go back in history, but it was kind of like France. Well, when Paris fell, pretty much the Germans pretty much had taken France. And so with Kiev falling, it is definitely sending a signature message to the rest of the country when your capital goes down. The advantage the Russians have is they have the resources, they have the military might to be able to take the capital. The interesting thing will be to see what kind of government will be established once, whatever they establish, if they get command and control of the area, and then how the Ukrainian people react. Because at the end of the day, is once you get in control of the capital, how will you feed the people? How will you govern the government? And then all the things that we call phase 4 operations come into play. And that's when you start having some discussion points, because now you're talking about sustaining a country with an occupying force. And so, Thomas, that's going to be a challenge, I do believe, in my opinion only, and that is Russia in for the long haul to be able to establish a government or put a puppet government in place to be able to maintain their command and control.
You make a really good point about that. And again, kind of going back into history, more recent history. I think we saw the same thing from that perspective as the American military when we had the Thunder run into Baghdad in 2003. We rolled in there hammer and anvil. We made it to Baghdad in a matter of weeks. And there were all these pictures of us pulling down statues of Saddam Hussein, and everybody was, excited, and we, oh, this is it. Like, that's it. We took Baghdad. Like, that's it. War's over. Desert Storm 2, pats on the back. Good job. And then we were there for another, 8 years. We still have a presence there, dealing with the insurgent fallout from that. So, yeah, like you said, we saw it in Afghanistan where, they worked from the outside in, and the capital was kind of their last. That was the chess piece. That was the final piece of the puzzle. The Russians seemed to be going for the capital first. That's what we did in Iraq. And we saw very, very mixed results for it. So, I think you make some good points there. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, but you're spot on. But here was the issue, and you brought up Thunder Run, and I'm glad you brought Thunder Run up. It was a great. From a military standpoint, it was a unbelievable feat and operation. But the struggle was once we decided to turn over to the MFI, multinational force infrastructure, that became an issue because we tried to formulate a government by taking out key people of the government to establish another government, which we shouldn't have done. So if any lessons learned from that situation, now in hindsight, as always, we realize that sometimes you have to keep some people in place because it stabilizes the country. The question will be, will the Russians learn from our missteps in Iraq and try to establish it? In Afghanistan, the major misstep is just, dealing with corruption and a whole bunch of gambit of different other factors, but you're talking about a westernized country. So I kind of looked over to Bosnia, and when the Serbians went into Bosnia-Herzegovina and looked at how they, kind of demoralized the government. Now, the question is, what are the Russians prepared to do long term once they get command and control of the capital city of Kiev?
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly didn't mean to imply that Iraq or Afghanistan, it was an apples to apples comparison, but it's just to show that, you know, there's a whole lot of ways that this could shake out, you know, and you certainly make a good point with that, you know, and so brings me on kind of my next talking point of, you know, kind of regardless of what happens thereafter, if they do take Kiev, you know, there's already been some questions about what about Poland, right? That's the next leapfrog for them. How far east, or excuse me, how far west do we think this is going to go? Is this going to be a, you know, a 1940s style blitzkrieg that takes half a continent, you know, or do we think that this is really at its core a regional conflict?
I mean, from all looks of it, and understanding that if you cross that red line and go into Poland, then now you're asking all of Europe, Central Europe, to bring arms and to bring arms to bear on the opposition. I don't believe, and I could be wrong, I don't believe that the Russians are willing to go into Poland, just for the simple fact that the buffer zone has always been Ukraine. It has always been the golden grail of their buffer zone. Poland actually at one point was, but the Germans were there. Then the Russians ran the Germans out of it. Then we went to the Warsaw Pact, the Iron Curtain, and then everything fell. And then Poland became part of the NATO. So now that Poland's part of the NATO, I think with the United States butted up with NATO forces sitting in Poland, I think they realize that they're at an impasse. And I think he's gotten what he wants. He currently has what he wants. Now the question is, long term, will he be able to hold it? And that's always the case. It's easy to get through the first 20 weeks. It's if you can hold it for 2 or 4, 2 to 3 years without blood and treasure, and that's going to be interesting to see, Thomas.
Yeah, you know, and there comes a point where the juice isn't worth the squeeze to keep pushing, and like you said, depending on how the following weeks, if Kiev falls and if there is a significant amount of resistance, it might not matter if Putin had any intention to go any further, because there's a realistic chance that he gets the Russian forces get bogged down in that, because I think regardless of what other, you know, pipe dreams or ambitions there may have been, holding Ukraine is going to be, like you said, it's essentially that's the grail, right? That's the crown jewel of whatever else this operation is supposed to be. Holding Ukraine is probably the critical point. And I think a lot of other things will be forsaken, or a lot of other goals will be given up to maintain that, if that's what it comes down to.
No, absolutely. So the question we might want to start asking ourselves is, where does Serbia sit in this situation now? Where do some of the other countries sit that are on the Yugoslavian, Czechoslovakian, and all those borders now? How does this play out with Ukraine going down? So will any assertiveness be pushed back into any of the older Eastern Bloc countries? Because now the key word here, and I hate to use this word, is appeasement. And we've used this word before many times. Appeasement has kicked in. And so even though we may say that, you know, we are going to apply sanctions and whatever we got to do as a nation with all the other European, the EU, we are in UK because they're single now. We definitely need to look at the appeasement piece of this. And if this is one, is he willing to take other areas down the road that are insignificant but significant to him? And Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia do fall in those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually did me a great favor, springboarding me right into kind of my last major talking point category I wanted to cover on this, which is our involvement, right? I mean, what does this mean for us? You know, you mentioned sanctions. I'll get to that in a minute. Kind of what I want to talk about first, though, is logistics and material aid, which I know from experience at your level of command is, you know, something that I'm sure you're familiar with. But I know for the last couple weeks, couple months, we have made measures and have delivered on, you know, aid shipments up to and including military weapons for Ukrainian forces. You know what? Let's just talk a little bit about that in terms of what that entails on our part, what we provided, how we got it there, what that means in terms of a partnership, because Ukraine is not formally a part of NATO, as we talked about before.
Right, and so when you look at what we probably supplied them with, small arms and medical supplies, the one thing that we did not really supply them with, and it was in the news, and it was that heavy arms. Now, if it was, definitely it was not put in national news, so many of us wouldn't know. But I'm sure we provided a few different weapon systems that will, help the infantry out. However, at the end of the day, when this all comes down to it, we all know mano a mano is when you start looking at what it takes to be able to maintain, be able to hold, then you need some required systems. And so right now, there's a pilot supposedly that's been in the news recently right here. He's doing an outstanding job. He has a skill set supposedly, and he's doing a great job, be it with great press that he's getting. The thing is, how many of those guys do they have in their arsenal and within their ranks? How many guys on the ground have the fortitude and the muster to keep up, be able to have a good stronghold on the areas? And so those are the issues that come up, is because, like all countries, we've supplied weapons before to other countries. The question is, even though we supply arms or we supply support, will they use it to defend their country? Because at the end of the day, I can give you everything in the biggest aid package possible, but if you don't have the people behind the weapon system with the fortitude to be able to execute under duress and make it happen, then it's a foregone conclusion. I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, you unfortunately cannot box up and ship the will to fight, right? And that's to not to say anything disparaging about what the Ukrainians are up against. It's certainly it's a bleak situation for them, right? Russia's forces are substantial, but like you said, sometimes all the best gear and the best equipment in the world by itself, that's not necessarily going to sway the tide one way or
That is correct.
It would definitely appear that they have the fortitude to fight, because again, you watching
absolutely.
some of the streams, they're definitely
they've started the fact that the amount of, I just saw a photo on Instagram, I think it was, of like an 87-year-old guy with a suitcase. He had like 2 shirts, a pair of pants, and like some sandwiches, who showed up trying to get to the front line. So there's certainly no question there in terms of them willing to stand up, and obviously best of luck to them. But sometimes, like I said, sometimes material aid, it's seen a wide variance of success, I think, in the past. If you look at the amount of times that we've tried that particular strategy, sometimes it shakes out, sometimes it makes a difference, and sometimes it doesn't help as much as we hoped it would.
No, you're absolutely right. And, I give my heart out to the Ukrainian people, because it's a hard pill to swallow, especially after me, working in Bosnia and seeing what happened with the Serbians that went into Bosnia, and then being in Iraq several tours. It's a hard pill to swallow, the fact that that you are a nation just trying to be a nation, and then you realize that you're dealing with occupation. A lot of people were making references back to 1935. They're making references back to then. I said, well, why we got to run all the way back to 35? I said, there's enough examples in Africa, and there's enough examples in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We don't have to go all the way back to 1935 to see authoritarian rule. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, so let's go from kind of, again, for a natural springboard here. So we've talked about sort of the material aid piece of that, and sometimes authoritarian leaders are going to just be authoritarian, and we have a range of options that we as Americans can examine to respond to that. And obviously, kind of the first round of our response to that has been economic sanctions. So there are some, we've seen a pretty swift and pretty aggressive sanction program being put out by the U.S. government, down to naming specific individuals and their immediate relatives and economically sanctioning them as individuals, which is something that I don't think you necessarily see very often. So let's talk about that a little. What about the sanction package. Off the cuff thoughts on is it really going to slow them down, or is the snowball already going down the hill on this?
Well, funny is, before we even got here, I think the problem was when Putin started having issues was you realize we moved a brigade into Poland, about 5 or 6 years ago. And so that brigade's been there, but here's the thing is we haven't removed that brigade. The brigade actually went in for exercising and it just stayed there. And we've just been replenishing that brigade. And we've been bolstering the forces with US forces in Poland. So I think a lot of that stirred issues with him. And so then now that we have to revert to sanctions, and we do have to go to sanctions because the simple fact is we realize the gravity of kinetic actions. Now, the targeting piece of this is will it hurt the upper class in Russia to cause them to come to some form of action to, go against or be upset with the Putin and the leadership? That's going to be interesting to see. But we realize sanctions do work. But here's the thing is, and the president kind of said the word resolve. We know, and everybody knows, if you're going to use sanctions, it's going to take forever. But the sad thing about sanctions is the people that actually suffer under sanctions that I've watched over my military career have been the common, ordinary people. Because somehow the rich have always found loopholes or ways to be able to maintain their lifestyle. And so the question is, even though we put the sanctions in there, are we going to be in a situation where actually the middle class or the middle class actually ends up being the group that suffers, and the people that are in the 1%, they're in the 1%. It doesn't impact them. And so there will be no resolve on their end. You know what I mean?
I do. You make an interesting point. I know some of the commentary in the news has been about how, like I said, that we've sanctioned certain individuals, but we stopped short of sanctioning Vladimir Putin as an individual, naming him directly in the sanctions. And you hit the nail on the head there, talking about basically a sort of large scale peer pressure, right? If we can sanction enough people around him, if we can hurt their wallets or cramp on their way of life hard enough to get them to sort of handle this issue internally, and maybe pull, like you said, Putin or the military leadership aside and go, hey man, this was all fun and games, but we need to wrap this up. And that's the hope. And unfortunately, like you said, sanctions are they're not a fast acting solution. And sometimes the trickle down effect of them, give us sort of the reverse of what we hope for.
No, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I think that a lot of people aren't really capturing is that they're going to start the restrictions on those people traveling. And so most of those people that have the money and the means like to get out of Russia and travel around. Now, one thing is, and I wasn't tracking, I don't know if you guys are, but I maybe need some insight. Did China come on board and support the Russians?
That's off the top of my head. I know the last thing I saw was a couple days ago, and it might have been actually before the invasion started. There was sort of kind of a public statement, a press release saying that that China and Russia were going to work to improve their relations and strengthen their relations. I have not come across anything specific in terms of China supporting the invasion.
I haven't seen anything.
I would suspect that they've been deliberately quiet on that and are maybe hedging their bets until this develops a little further.
Right, and then that's the piece. The reason I was bringing that up is because I think right now one of the biggest cruxes is to see where the Chinese are sitting at on this situation. And so as we look at it overall, Gavin, we know where the West sits. And when I say the West, it's Central Europe, United States, and UK. Now the question is and I know Japan has already done something, but the question now is where does everybody else sit? Because if China doesn't say anything or does not come on board, I'm going to tell you, us putting sanctions on the Russians is going to be hard to be able for it to impact them. And I'm just going to, and it's just because the end around. So it's
right. Well, yeah, there's a chance that anything that we cut off gets backfilled by some other nation, China or anybody else that chooses not to step up on this.
Absolutely.
Some of the sanctions, they don't include energy, or there's some exceptions that they don't include energy or agriculture.
I know that what I've seen, and obviously I've kind of been trying to get spun up on the fly on this, just like everybody else, I'm sure. But most of what I've seen and read has had to do with the Russian financial market, cutting off their access to the U.S. banking system and preventing the U.S. from doing preventing entities from doing business with them, seizing any assets that in any way touch the U.S. Financial system. I know that I believe that there were some, like you said, some exceptions made to the point that General Buggs made a couple minutes ago about that sometimes you can over sanction, or you can improperly sanction in a way that winds up hurting the people that are just trying to get through the day, that your middle class, your lower class, your folks that kind of don't necessarily even have anything to do with this directly, your everyday citizens. And so I think that may be why some of those critical infrastructure type exceptions might be in place.
Yeah, and Thomas and Glenn, you guys are spot on. But it comes down to, how do you impact the 1% to be able to put pressure on the Kremlin to make a decision? And that's going to be interesting to find out if they're able to do that. And if they are, then maybe we'll get an early resolve, and everybody will come to some common ground. The thing was, Ukraine never got into NATO. Ukraine was actually asking to be a partner, and they had been training with Western forces, asking for partnership down the road. The fact that they were directed not to be able to join, and the United States held back on that argument the last 3 or 4 weeks. This is where we're at now. We're with forces right outside the Capitol in the 21st century. We are dealing with a possible takeover of a country by another government, and it will be interesting to see how, if sanctions work, or in the long term, how this all plays out, good, bad, or indifferent. But the lesson to be learned right now is that we've seen this story before. It's just a different time in a different era.
You brought me right up to my last point, actually, and that is this. So historically, NATO's approach to this kind of thing is, as you well know, has been sort of the slogan was always, an attack on one is an attack on all. Ukraine is not a NATO partner. That's not to say that they're not deserving of assistance, and we've tried to kind of avoid being overly speculative here in this discussion. But this is pretty open-ended right now, and I think that there's a lot of Americans wondering if this, does this look like American troops deploying to Kiev and getting in a shooting war with Russia?
I mean, economically, the one thing about the global market, it kind of puts us in a situation where that can't happen. Now, this 1960 something missile crisis with Cuba, we had a bigger opportunity where we possibly could have had some friction points with the Russians. At this point, we realize that, and they do realize that there are certain areas and parameters that both nations have to adhere to. And I don't ever see the United States, not saying it can't happen. However, right now, I don't see the United States or any of the other Western countries putting themselves into the mix of going up against the Russian bear, because it's that the same thing is because of commerce. And that's why the pipeline is so huge with Germany and the Russians, is because now that we decided to go with this global market, and we decided everybody to be tied into the same systems in many ways, you hurt yourself and in some ways. And so I think that's the reason everybody's trying to calm the storm, is because economically you kind of can hurt yourself. And so if gas prices shoot up in the United States, everything has second and third order effects right now. And so, yeah, I'm with you on board that, the United States is going to have to do something in it right now. That sadly to say, it's the tortoise approach, sanction.
Well, we do have a comment from Barry. Says, regarding the question, is the snowball rolling down the hill at this point? Says, recent reports of Russia open for talks at this point could possibly give a clue as to Russia's intentions and objectives. It could see, he says, it could still go any direction from here. So again, everybody is, speculation and speculating and thinking. So he actually had another good comment. So Barry, we appreciate your input. He says, as far as on Chernobyl, material for dirty bombs, ? So there's there's nothing to get somebody like me, like, okay, what's going on here? Like I'm still like, I don't know. Why
Yeah,
are you
no,
going
those
on at Chernobyl? I'll come back to that later, I guess. But
both good comments. I actually had not heard Russia make any comments about being open to talks, but I'm sure that the situation is different now than it was when we started this thing 20 30 minutes ago.
yeah.
Which this is just a kind of a broad strokes, hoping to bring our audience up to speed, and give you guys our take on it. And on that note, we certainly appreciate those of you who tuned in, those of you guys who left comments. Glenn, did we have any questions or?
There was a couple people that were just listening. A lot of people was, talking about keep it going. A lot of guys were listening. So what we'll do is we'll post this. We'll post this later on to get some conversations going. And once it's live, we may circle back in a couple days, because I know we had what Dan Brokos who's looking to jump on, as well as a few others. But we'll circle back next week. In general, if we could pick your brain again, maybe next week, that would be awesome. But again, for everybody watching and listening, if you want to check out some of General Bug's private podcast, he runs Embrace the Power. You want to plug that again real quick?
All right, so I'm on Embrace the Power on YouTube. So just plug in. We go live on Sundays and Saturdays most of the time. We just plug in and check it out, and we have a gambit of different guests on. So we're in November. We're going to have a bunch of generals and a bunch of enlisted soldiers coming on, just talking about different topics. And we also have music artists coming on. And some reason we have a lot of country artists. So Glenn's been checking us out. Yeah. We got a lot of country artists that are coming on, up and coming. And we're just a blessed podcast, and we got a lot of affiliations coming up. And so I appreciate it. So if you got time, just check us out and enjoy some fun and smile a little bit if you have a moment. Thank you, Glenn.
All right. Hey, General, again, thank you very much. Thank you for your service. Thank you for teaching at the local high school. I don't know if that's really considered retirement, but we appreciate your service all the time. So, and Tom, I appreciate it. I guess for now, guys, we'll let that go for now, and we'll try to pick this back up next week. So,
thanks for tuning in, guys. In general, thank you for your time.
All right, thank you, guys.